Truly remarkable. Matt Ryan, NFL MVP, dominance across the board. Last year was a regression, and yet it still was it was one of the most criticized, pretty good offensive seasons I've ever seen.
They just couldn't perform in the red zone. That was it. They
Which
could
is
not score a
kind of
touchdown.
important.
Yeah, it is important.
And I understand why all the criticism was there, but we were having a little conversation before the show started. Do we just not give Matt Ryan enough credit?
Absolutely. I think he's a fringe top 5 talent at the position. I think he's very good. But yeah, I mean, incredibly last year. You look at his numbers, pass attempts from the year before, again, his MVP season, if you will, they dropped by 5. His pass attempts dropped by 5. His passing yards fell by 849 and his touchdowns by 18. Fell from 2nd to 15th in fantasy points. And this is hard to believe. It's crazy. He had one weekly finish better than 10th last season, and it came in week 17. He was dreadful from a fantasy perspective.
He had one or fewer. You know what fewer than one is? Zero. He had one or fewer touchdowns in 11 of his 16 games. I mean, it's no wonder that fantasy owners were frustrated. So why should, this is a question that, I've seen it in the mock drafts that we've done, people just shying away from that offense. Why should we be convinced that it will be different?
Well, and I'll follow up on that too. He's never had a finish other than 2016 better than 7th in fantasy points either. So was that the fluke year, or should we actually buy into a bounce back season? That's what I'm struggling with.
So let's get to the Ryan thing, and I want to get to a lesson learned from last year that is important to reiterate. So Mike, you're telling me basically, and all this evidence that you just pointed out suggests Matt Ryan does not need to be drafted as a starter in a 10 or maybe even a 12-team league.
I agree with that. I think he's just on the outside. Again, we have a lot of options at the position. He has shown us over time, again, over the long term, that he's not really a guy you expect to be a top 5 or a top 3 option at the position. He just had that 1 year. That being said, when you throw the ball to the end zone to Julio Jones 16 times and only 1 gets caught, that's a regression. That is regression to the mean written all over it. And we'll get to Julio here shortly, but I think that he will find the end zone more through the air, but also he's not going to add a lot with his legs.
Yeah.
It's tough. There's 2 sides of this one. I think he's more of a good QB too.
My hook is just, as you point out, Mike, is he has 2 seasons in his career with 30 or more passing touchdowns. Like, that's the floor for Aaron Rodgers or Tom Brady if they stay healthy. The floor. Matt Ryan has 2 in his career, and he's been playing since 2008. Moreover, he hasn't had a rushing touchdown since 2012.
Yeah, you're not going to get one from him.
And people will say, well, what about Brady? He's not going to have a rushing touchdown this year. It's no guarantee.
Unless you're at the goal line.
First of all, it's possible. It's possible for either one of them. But moreover, Brady doesn't need rushing touchdowns when he's throwing for 30 to 35 or maybe even 40 touchdowns in a given season. We like Matt Ryan as a player. We understand why they double down on him with an investment this offseason. Fantasy and reality often align in football, but there's sometimes a disconnect, right? An excellent football quarterback might not be an excellent fantasy quarterback every time.
I will say this, Kyle Shanahan's second seasons when they exploded, this is Steve Sarkisian's second season with the team, and by the way, loaded offense on paper. Great line, great weapons. Austin Hooper, year 3 good receivers, 2 good running backs. I mean, it's possible. It's possible he busts out, but I think he's safest viewed, like you said, as a fringe starter.
There are days where I wake up, I wake up every single morning thinking about, mid-tier RB2s. But sometimes I do.
Yeah, I have that.
It happens to us all, right? And I think that Devonta Freeman should be regarded as a top 10 fantasy running back this season. And then there are days where I quickly talk myself out of that notion. There's a second running back in the backfield in Tevin Coleman. The Falcons have been dutiful in making sure that both players get plenty of run. Plus, sometimes they ride the hot hand, and Tevin Coleman's really talented. Mike, where do you fall on this side of the should Devonta Freeman be an absolute starter every single week in your lineup?
I have him at 12. So every week starter, absolutely. An RB1 kind of on the fringe. I feel like there's a lot of good options at the position this season, which is why he falls just outside the top 10. But I like him. I mean, look at his work near the goal line. That's where I really go to with Freeman. He's going to be the guy when the end zone is near. 29 rushing touchdowns the past 3 seasons, 41 carries inside the 5. That is second most in the entire NFL. Remember, just a few seasons ago, he dominated. By far was the top scoring fantasy running back. I don't have the concerns others do with him. He's just been super effective, gets plenty of volume and a good offense and a lot of work at the goal line. I think he'll be fine.
I think I'm like you, Field, because I wake up some days and I think, why am I not valuing Devonta Freeman more? He's a fantastic runner. He's very physical, and I think that's also for me the double-edged sword. Remember last year he had a concussion, and there were concerns about his return because he had one previously. He expressed some concern, and understandably so, about this. But the way he runs and running through people, he's going to be more vulnerable to that type of injury potentially. He also had a knee issue that he played into the offseason. I mean, he continued to play with it, which is a reflection of how tough he is, but it definitely hurt his running ability in the late stretch of the season. It's not something you take care of surgically. It was rest and rehab. We're assuming this is all behind him, but we're not going to see him in the preseason. It's part of what the team is doing to protect him. If the team's concerned about protecting him, if he's expressed some concern just about protecting himself, I worry a little bit that it's a legitimate reason to be concerned about whether he can deliver both in volume and all year long.
I think the concern, as we mentioned at the top, is not that he can be started every single week, but that he should be he has RB1 upside versus some of the other players that are ranked right around him. You know, maybe you think that Kenyon Drake has a better shot as finishing as an RB1 this year, just as an example of somebody that might be closely ranked to Devonta Freeman. Here is what makes Atlanta interesting, is in a different but similar way to Tennessee, they have two running backs that can be utilized almost every single week, which brings us back to Tevin Coleman. Mike, you're the highest amongst our ESPN rankers, I believe, at 29 for Tevin Coleman. His touches have increased every single year on a per-game basis in his career. Is he a player that only fits if you play in PPR scoring? Where do you view Tevin Coleman this year versus other players that might be starters in their backfield, just not as capable as overall players?
Yeah, he's one of the first backup running backs, I suppose, or number two running backs that I would pick in a draft because he does have some standalone value. In fact, he's finished no worse than 22nd at running back each of the past two seasons. Very efficient, 4.2 yards per carry, 12.4 yards per reception, which is incredible. Averaging almost 10 touchdowns per season. He gets the ball, near the goal line just enough. And by the way, elite handcuff appeal here too. If something does happen to Freeman, we saw him last year in that situation where he was the clear number one back and he was 8th in fantasy points at the running back position. Oh, and one more, if you buy into it's a contract year, a lot to play for. It is a contract year, and he is right now. If you look at contract year running backs, he's probably going to be one of the most coveted, if not the most coveted guy next year because of his youth and his upside. So a lot on the table for him this season.
That's probably a fair point, Stephania, on the handcuff value, is that there are other players that you are drafting as handcuffs because you think it only happens if the starter goes down, whether it's a Chase Edmonds in Arizona. The only way he is fantasy relevant is if David Johnson's not on the field. But, for Tevin Coleman, the value's double-barreled, right? I mean, you have a player that maybe at worst is a flex play in deeper league considerations. At best is an RB1.
Yeah, let's not forget his rookie season. I mean, we would have seen more Tevin Coleman, but he started off with a hamstring injury.
Yep.
And that is literally what shifted the balance there. So what you've been able to see in the last two seasons, I think, has been a product of him being healthier. And you guys already mentioned it. When Devonta Freeman was out, you saw it. It's not, we're not talking about the Saints where they're like, okay, we don't want to overwork Kamara. So with Mark Ingram out, he's not going to get any more volume. Tevin Coleman's volume went up when Devonta Freeman was out. They're not afraid to use him as a number one back.
Let me ask you this, Mike. Ito Smith, does he make your dynasty, keeper league, keep an eye on him type guys?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he could be their number two.
Clumsy way of asking it. But
yeah. I mean, I don't know what the future holds for the Falcons backfield, especially if, like Stephania said, Freeman continues to have injury issues and they can move on from Coleman after the season for sure. Again, he's probably going to be able to get paid more elsewhere. So Smith could be in for a significant role in 2018 if someone gets hurt, or certainly 2019. But he's kind of, I think I have him ranked like 15th or 16th in this rookie running back class. He's a deep league stash. I wouldn't go much further than that.
It's right. 4th-round pick out of Southern Miss, a guy that, again, with the idea that Tevin Coleman's going into a contract year, you never know what could happen a year from now for him. It feels weird to say this, but arguably the most talented wide receiver in the league is a little bit divisive for fantasy football in some ways.
He shouldn't be. But
he should not be.
Go on.
Mike, you have him number 2 in your rankings this year. I've got him at 4. Again, that's not really a major indictment. I don't think that it's divisive in the sense that we all agree is going to be a really good player and is a really, really good player. But, like just for example, Daniel, and I don't want to put you on the spot here, but
put me on the spot.
You believe that you do not believe in drafting Julio Jones this year. Is that correct?
That is correct.
You're insane.
Here's the thing. Julio Jones is that wide receiver that will win you 2 or 3 or 4 weeks with these massive games out of nowhere.
Okay.
But he cannot get in the end zone. Mike, you're going to tell me all about the positive regression and all about, I understand what you're going to say, but if I'm drafting that high, I want someone that has more consistency week in and week out than what Julio Jones will give me from that spot and potentially the first round.
All right. You have a lot of bad takes. This is your worst take, for sure. Let's get that out of the way.
Sure. Also, I just want to say that Shawshank Redemption is one of the most overrated movies in the history of cinema.
So this is how we understand that your opinion is totally wrong.
I'll throw one in there, too. The Wire is overrated. All right.
Okay.
All right, let's move
I
on.
love The Wire. Are you kidding me?
That doesn't help us with your justification for Julio Jones.
Well, I'm gonna deal facts. So
all right, give it to me. Tell me why I should trust a up and down Julio Jones.
All right, next one. So first of all, it's a bad take. Second, you mentioned consistency. You can look back on someone and say they were inconsistent. That's fine. That doesn't project forward. You can't really project consistency. So you can't say, if he's getting a lot of volume, but his fantasy production's inconsistent, you can't say that means it's going to be inconsistent going forward. That's proven too.
Totally true. I understand that. It's more of like when you get burned as a fantasy player, sometimes you're just like, I've given up on that guy and I'll go with somebody else.
Okay, fair enough. Well, that's why I'm telling you why you do not do that. Okay, so he's been a top 7 fantasy receiver 4 years in a row, and that is with him underperforming in the touchdown department. And there was a change last season. So for years with Kyle Shanahan, he was not forcing him the ball at the goal line. That was a problem. That's why he wasn't scoring. That was not the case last season. 16 end zone targets was 8th most in the NFL. On a normal season, he would have scored 8 or 9 touchdowns. He would have been right in that sort of area near the top of the leaderboard. So if his usage does not change this season, and I don't think it will, there's no indication that it will, he will be closer to double-digit touchdowns than he will 3 or 4 scores. So I'm all in for sure. 2
things. I watched a lot of those games, and there were a number of those targets that were inaccurate. He was targeted in the end zone, but they were impossible catches. So when you hear the data about that he was targeted so many times and he only came down with one. Now he had one that was a clear out drop that everybody gasped. We were watching it together because he never misses those. But there were a number that were off target. So I think that stat doesn't represent Julio Jones. The other question I would ask you is wide receiver cornerback matchups. This is what you do. He, from the eyeball test to me, appears to be one of the most uncoverable, in other words, DB proof wide receivers out there. Do the numbers back that up?
I would agree with that. He's a guy that I rarely will write about. I mean, he might have a really tough matchup. Maybe Marshawn Lattimore is going to shadow him, and I'll mention it. But it's not like I'm moving him more than a spot or 2 in my ranking. So, like Antonio Brown, DeAndre Hopkins, perhaps. Those are guys that are matchup proof, if you will.
Hopkins, Michael Thomas, Devontae Adams. I would take OBJ. I would take all 4 of those guys over Julio Jones this year.
Insane, but
bad
anyway.
take.
Can you guys recall a player that was ranked this high at any position, maybe amongst running backs and wide receivers, that you said that you have a similar feeling to what Daniel's having this year with Julio Jones?
No.
Yeah,
I don't know.
And hey, listen, Daniel. There's
all I'm saying is you look at our Twitter stream and there are people that are like, "Yeah, I've been burned by Julio. I'd rather have somebody that's
recency bias in terms of how you feel, and that's part of what makes fantasy football what it is. I mean, all joking aside, it's like you want to play with the players that you want on your team. So, despite the fact that Mike's going to give you all the facts and I'm going to give you some more facts, you're just going to ignore them.
You have them ranked
go with your heart.
What do you have them ranked at, Stephania? 2?
My wide receiver rankings are not yet complete, but you'll know by this weekend.
Okay, so Mike, you've got them ranked at wide receiver 2. I'll take that bet.
I drafted
Julio Jones will not finish
in the fantasy draft the other week as my top wide receiver. I think I had the 10th pick. I think I took him around there.
Here's one thing I'll say. I think he has. I don't think he does. I know he has a shot at history this year with 1,400 or more receiving yards. He'll become the first player to ever have 1,400 or more yards in a single season for 5 straight years. Currently, it's just him and Marvin Harrison, which happened from 1999 to 2002 that have done it.
Hashtag good at football.
Hashtag very good at football.
Hashtag amazing physical specimen, too.
Sort of the other pieces in this Atlanta offense. Let's get to them because not Julio Jones, regardless of whether you are on Team Daniel or Team Mike / Stephania in that Julio debate, there are other players that could impact this offense. Stephania is Team Calvin Ridley. Mike, if you had to pick one other Falcons pass catcher, not named Julio Jones, between Mohamed Sanu, Calvin Ridley, and even Austin Hooper, their tight end, where do you lean?
Yeah, it's a tough call because Sanu has been so solid, right? He's finished top 35 in fantasy points each of the past 2 seasons, including 29th last year, but he's mostly used underneath, and he's never scored more than 5 touchdowns in a season, so he has some limitations. That has me thinking I almost want to throw the dart at Ridley in the late rounds and just see if he proves to be the real deal, makes an impact quickly, passes out Sanu. You know, the sky could be the limit here, maybe potentially a lot of big, long touchdowns in the kind of the Brandon Cook sort of realm. So he's the guy I think I would throw the dart at. Austin Hooper, I know he could make a breakout. He could have a breakout season this year like we thought he would last year, but there's a lot of tight ends in that sort of tier. I don't think he's necessarily more than maybe a 15th round pick in drafts.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, listen, both players are talented for that matter. I've always felt like with Mohamed Sanu, and I think I used this last year, and like Matthew got like really animated about it. I described him as like sort of a perfect flex play, right, in a PPR league, because you don't like your flex player is often going to be a player that you might be looking at 8 to 12 points. A lot of times when Mohamed Sanu performs as expected, it's 8 to 12 points. It's rarely 20, and it's rarely 4.
I was going to say, weren't you? I remember you recommending him like so many weeks last year, and every week it was pretty consistent in what he delivered.
But that's the thing is that I think in fantasy football so often people either reach for the stars or just pass on a player entirely. Mohamed Sanu is not the league winner, but again, when it gets to bye weeks and you play in a deeper league and you're choosing between Mohamed Sanu or, just making this up here, like the Bills' number 2 wide receiver, Corey Coleman, for example, give me Mohamed Sanu every single time.